This is for the literature paper 1, sign of 4, and a real focus, a particular focus on the opening of chapter 5, the tragedy of Pondicherry Lodge. In this chapter in particular, we see the development of the relationship between Dr. Watson and Mary Morstan. And we see them as their relationship develops, where in a difficult situation, in a scary situation, they hold hands and they turn to each other for comfort. So what's happened is it's late at night, and Holmes, Watson and Miss Morstan, they leave the City of London behind, and for the first time the story takes us to a different setting and takes us to the setting of Pondicherry Lodge. They travel by coach and they leave London behind, and that's a comment you can make. That's a structure comment that would be useful to make there. And when they get there, in contrast to earlier, where Sherlock Holmes felt very confident about being able to solve the mystery, the gates are locked and they're kept waiting outside, and they're not allowed to go in, not until Holmes reveals who he is to the gatekeeper. And the house is in darkness, and the housekeeper is clearly troubled and clearly frightened. There's clearly something here that's not right. And we also see in this chapter, Conan Doyle creates a tone of suspense, and we see the sense of mystery deepen. Note that the tone becomes quite Gothic. There are a lot of Gothic elements in the opening of chapter 5, and that's something in particular I'd like you to notice. So the chapter opens, and actually it's quite positive to start with. Dr. Watson talks about it being an adventure, and they've left the damp fog of the great city behind us, and so we see a real contrast with the fog and the swirling fog of London with what we see here, which is it's fine, there's a warm wind and clear enough for us to see in the distance. So there are images to start with that suggest that this is going to be an adventure and that things aren't going to be difficult. They are going to be able to solve this mystery. However, when they get there and they're locked out, we get this description of Pondicherry Lodge, which stands in its own grounds. It's got a very high stone wall and a single narrow iron clamped door. Look at those adjectives there. You should be able to write about those adjectives that create an image of a Gothic setting, of things being locked in, things being locked out. It's high stone, it's preventing people from getting access in. There's a gruff voice from within, and somebody comes and creates a grumbling sound and a clanking and a jarring of keys. And you should write about there the onomatopoeia there of the clanking and the jarring, which typical device used in Gothic horror. And the door swung heavily back to reveal somebody standing there, and it might remind you of the opening where Dracula opens the door and remind you of those Gothic images of the character of Dracula. And we see this character's got a protruded face and distrustful eyes, and so immediately the reader knows that there's something amiss here. And Conan Doyle goes on to describe the gravel path that leads to desolate grounds and a huge clump of the house. And again we see the word prosaic repeated from earlier in chapter 1, things that are dull and unimaginative and plunged in shadow. Lots of images of darkness and images of isolation and images of something that creates a sense of terror. The garret window is mentioned. This reminds us of an attic where something might be locked in or something might be hidden from view. And there's a gloom and a deathly silence which struck a chill to the heart. And again, these images create a sense of the terror, create a sense of the mystery. And look, even the lantern that you know from your portable points, that the images of light that should be creating images of light and hope, even the lantern quivered and rattled, those verbs subverting the idea of the light that should be being created by the lantern. Amongst these images of terror and suspense and mystery, Miss Morstan turns to Dr. Watson and seized my wrist. There's connotations there that she grabbed his wrist, she did it very quickly, and she held on tight from a sense of terror, and their hearts are thumping from the great black house, that images of the fear. And we hear the saddest and most pitiful of sounds, the shrill, broken whimpering of a frightened woman. We've got a hint there for the reader that the idea of femininity, and the idea that in this story, in a Victorian story, there's a woman who needs help, might need rescuing, might need to turn to, and the man in the story, the male in the story, to help. And in amongst all these images of darkness and terror and fear, Mary Morstan and Dr. Watson are together, and he describes how Her hand was in mine, a wondrous, subtle thing. And our hands instinctively sought for each other. Instinctively, that adverb suggesting that it was something that happened automatically, it was something that they did without thought. They just quite naturally turned to each other for comfort. And there was in her the instinct to turn to me for comfort and protection. Look at those nouns there, that she's turned to him and they've turned to each other for help. And we get a beautiful image here where they stood hand in hand, like two children. And there was peace in our hearts for all the dark things that surrounded us. And that simile there, like two children, connotations of innocence and openness and new beginnings, and reminds the reader of Dr. Watson and Mary Morstan just starting out in their relationship and starting afresh, and the peace in their hearts, the peace that the comfort and turning to each other brings, even though they're surrounded by dark things. And so through this extract, the reader is reminded of a key theme of romance and of relationships and love through the development of the characters of Dr. Watson and Mary Morstan.